Every Thursday, a pickup truck backs into a driveway in Bellingham, Washington, and dumps hundreds of pounds of rotting apples onto the lawn. The smell is so thick, neighbors hold their breath. The HOA threatens fines. Parents keep their kids away. Joanna Voss doesn't explain. She just piles the fruit higher, checking it like something precious. Then a chef from Portland hears a rumor, drives up unannounced, digs a spoon into the pile, and tastes something nobody else knew was being made. Her name is Joanna Voss. She is not a chef. She is not a farmer. She is a former lab technician who walked away from a six-figure biotech job because she could not stop thinking about the mountains of fruit rotting behind the orchards she grew up near. The paste she produces now sells for over $40 a jar. But the real story is not the price tag. It is what she discovered about controlled decay that an entire industry had missed for a century. Joanna Voss grew up 5 miles from those orchards. She spent her childhood watching truckloads of perfectly good fruit get carted off to landfills because a hailstorm had dimpled the skin, or a branch had knocked them to the ground a day too early. Her father managed a cold storage facility. Her mother worked the sorting line. So Joanna learned early what the industry considered worthless. She also learned she never wanted to end up on that sorting line herself. She got out. Full scholarship to the University of Washington, then a biochemistry degree, then a research position at a biotech firm in Seattle making monoclonal antibodies. The pay was excellent. The work was sterile, precise, and by every conventional measure, a success story. By 29, Joanna was making more money than both her parents combined. She also hadn't slept through the night in 3 years. The lab hummed 24 hours a day, and somewhere in that fluorescent-lit monotony, she started dreaming about the smell of wet apples. When she finally quit, her supervisor told her she was making the biggest mistake of her career. Joanna didn't argue. She bought the small holding outside Bellingham with her savings, walked onto the overgrown acreage, and called the largest orchard within 50 miles. She asked if they had fruit they needed to get rid of. The operations manager laughed and said he could fill a swimming pool with it by the end of the week. The first truck arrived on a Thursday, the second the Thursday after that. Within a month, the pile behind her barn was taller than the barn itself. The smell drifted across property lines fast. The HOA notice arrived by certified mail, citing unsanitary conditions and demanding immediate removal. A neighbor stood at her gate and asked if she was mentally ill. Joanna said nothing. She just kept burying temperature probes into the pile, recording data in a notebook and waiting. Because what her neighbors saw as a rotting heap of garbage, Joanna was treating as a living laboratory. She wasn't composting those apples. She was inoculating them. Specifically, she was introducing a strain of koji mold, the same fungus used to make soy sauce and miso, directly into the chopped fruit. Koji breaks down proteins and starches into amino acids and simple sugars, creating an explosion of umami and sweetness from material that started with almost none. But nobody had ever tried it on an industrial scale with apples, and for the first 6 months, it looked like nobody should have. Her first 4 attempts molded over in the wrong direction entirely. Black fuzz, green slime, a smell so aggressive she had to wear a respirator to get near it. She lost 8,000 pounds of fruit and burned through half her savings on temperature-controlled containers. Her ex-colleagues from the biotech world told her to cut her losses. Her uncle told her to burn the pile and plant something sensible. Then, on a wet December morning, Joanna pulled back the tarp on batch number 7 and stood frozen. The paste wasn't black or slimy. It was deep gold, dense, and fragrant with notes of caramel, apple brandy, and something almost nutty. She scooped a fingertip into the center of the pile and tasted it. Then she sat down on the wet ground and cried. She knew she had something nobody else had ever made. She also knew she had no idea how to sell it. And that was the moment the first chef called. The chef was Marco Herrera, executive chef at Leeward, a farm-to-table restaurant in Portland that had just earned its first James Beard nomination. He had heard about Joanna from a forager who supplied him with wild mushrooms. The forager had stopped by Joanna's property to drop off chanterelles, taken one whiff of the pile behind the barn, and asked what kind of experiment was happening. Joanna had handed him a tiny mason jar of the gold paste. He tasted it in the truck, turned around, and driven straight to leeward. Marco called Joanna the next morning. He asked if he could come up and see the pile himself. Joanna said yes, but warned him to wear boots he didn't care about. Marco arrived in a spotless white chef's coat, which was a mistake. By the time he left, the cuffs were permanently stained amber, and he had bought every ounce of finished paste she had, 24 4-ounce jars. He put fermented apple paste on the menu that weekend, smeared under a seared duck breast with black garlic and juniper. The dish sold out in 3 nights. Marco called back and said he would take whatever she could make for the rest of the year. What Marco tasted that morning was not ordinary fermentation. Joanna had not invented a new process from scratch. She had borrowed a technique from Japanese koji production, but applied it to a fruit that no commercial producer had ever thought to use. Koji mold typically grows on steamed rice or barley. It produces enzymes that break down complex carbohydrates into simple sugars and amino acids, the same chemical reactions that give miso and soy sauce their deep savory richness. Apples are not rice. They are acidic, full of water, vulnerable to rot. But Joanna had spent years culturing cells in a lab. She knew how to isolate a specific strain of koji and adapt it to a hostile environment. That was the part nobody else had figured out. The paste that came out of her piles was not sweet like applesauce. It was dense and savory, with layers of flavor that deepened the longer it aged. A 3-month batch tasted like sharp cheddar and cooked apple. A 6-month batch shifted into something closer to aged Parmesan, with a faint hint of brandy on the finish. Chefs started describing it as vegan umami concentrate. One food writer compared it to black garlic crossed with 18-year-aged balsamic. There was nothing else like it on the market. Word moved through the Pacific Northwest restaurant scene the way it always does, from line cook to sous chef to group text. Within 10 days of Marco's first purchase, 3 more kitchens called. One was a 2-Michelin-star restaurant in Seattle that wanted an exclusive. Another was a fermentation-forward bar in San Francisco looking for a cocktail ingredient. The third was a meal kit startup that had no idea what they were asking for, but had heard someone mention the word gold and apples in the same sentence and wanted in on the trend. Joanna sold to the first 2. She politely declined the third. The attention was flattering, but it was also a crisis. Joanna had produced only enough paste to fill a single shelf of Marco's walk-in cooler. Scaling up meant more piles, more space, more temperature-controlled containers, and a lot more money. She crunched the numbers on her kitchen table and realized she would need to triple her production just to meet the demand she already had. That meant more apple deliveries. The orchard was happy to oblige. They were saving $40,000 a year in disposal fees just by sending trucks to her property instead of the landfill. But more apples meant more piles, and more piles meant the smell was about to get a whole lot worse before it got better. The HOA had already filed 2 formal complaints. A neighbor had started photographing the piles from the road and posting them on a community Facebook group with captions like, "Would you eat something that came out of this?" Another had contacted the county health department, claiming Joanna was operating an unlicensed food processing facility. None of them had any idea what she was actually making. They just knew it smelled strange, looked worse, and didn't fit the neighborhood's definition of acceptable. Then the visit happened that changed everything. A health inspector showed up unannounced on a Thursday afternoon, clipboard in hand, expression already set to disapproval. Joanna walked her out to the barn, showed her the fermentation logs, the pH readings, the temperature graphs, the rigorous sanitation protocols she had adapted directly from her biotech days. The inspector, a woman named Diane who had spent 15 years inspecting commercial kitchens and food plants, asked a dozen questions. Then she asked to taste it. Joanna handed her a spoon. Diane stood in the barn for a full minute, saying nothing. Then she closed her clipboard, told Joanna the operation was well within cottage food laws for fermentation, and asked if she could buy a jar for her husband, who was a chef instructor at a culinary school in Portland. That school became her 7th client. By the end of the first year, Joanna was producing 1,200 jars a month. The paste was listed on tasting menus from Seattle to San Francisco, billed as a house-made ingredient that nobody could replicate. She had hired two former orchard hands to help manage the piles, and she'd converted a shipping container into a temperature-controlled aging room. Revenue had crossed six figures, and the same neighbors who'd once called her property a nuisance were now knocking on her door asking for samples. But that was also the moment the letters started coming. Not from neighbors, not from the HOA. From a food conglomerate based in Chicago, the kind of corporation that owns dozens of artisanal brands and sells them to grocery chains across the country. The letter was cordial, complimentary, and included a seven-figure offer to acquire her entire process. There was just one condition. She would have to relocate production to a facility in Illinois, standardize the recipe, and cease all operations on her Bellingham property within 90 days. Joanna read the letter at her kitchen table, the same table where she'd crunched her first numbers. Outside, the latest truckload of bruised apples was settling into its pile, the familiar scent drifting through the cracked window. She had spent her entire career walking away from things that looked too good to be true. This time, she wasn't sure she could afford to say no, but she also wasn't sure she could survive saying yes. At that moment, she didn't yet know that an entirely different kind of offer was about to arrive, one that would make the corporate deal look like pocket change. The second letter arrived exactly 1 week after the first. It came on heavy cardstock, no return address, and it was not a letter at all. It was an invitation. The Noma Fermentation Lab in Copenhagen wanted Joanna to fly out and present her process to their research team. They had heard about the apple paste from a chef who had staged at Leeward, and they believed she had done something no one else had successfully attempted. The invitation included a first-class plane ticket, accommodations, and a consulting fee that was, by itself, more than her entire first year of revenue. Joanna read the card 3 times before she let herself breathe. Noma was not just any restaurant. Its fermentation lab had launched dozens of products into the global culinary market, from garums to vinegars to miso pastes that chefs in 40 countries now ordered by the case. A nod from them was as close to a coronation as the fermentation world got. The Chicago conglomerate wanted her to disappear into a facility in Illinois. Noma wanted her to teach the world. For a brief, bright moment, the path seemed obvious. Then the phone rang. It was the conglomerate's legal counsel. Word of the Noma invitation had traveled faster than Joanna thought possible, and the tone had shifted from cordial to something harder. The company was now prepared to pursue an alternative route. They had already filed a provisional patent on a koji-based apple fermentation process, citing prior art from publicly available food science journals. They did not need her to sell. They just needed her to stay out of the way. The offer was still on the table, the lawyer said, but the window was closing. Joanna hung up and realized the ground had just shifted beneath her feet. While she was processing that, 2 more things happened almost simultaneously. The first was that her neighbor, the one who had been photographing the piles and posting on Facebook, filed a formal nuisance lawsuit. The suit alleged that the odor from the property had lowered adjacent home values and caused respiratory distress. It asked for an injunction to halt all fermentation operations immediately. Joanna had been operating in a gray area under cottage food laws, a space that depended largely on nobody making trouble. The lawsuit changed that. A judge would now have to decide whether controlled fermentation on a small holding counted as farming, food processing, or a public nuisance. The hearing was set for 6 weeks out. The second thing happened in her lab. One of the temperature probes in batch number 11 malfunctioned, and when Joanna pulled the tarp to check, she found a section of the pile that had been sitting at the wrong temperature for at least 3 days. Instead of going bad, it had bloomed with a second, unintended fermentation, a wild lactobacillus that had crept in and created something entirely new, a thick, tangy liquid pooling at the bottom of the container. She tested the pH, she isolated the strain. And she realized, with a shock that sent her back to her old lab notebooks, that the compound profile was nearly identical to a rare antimicrobial peptide her biotech team had spent 2 years trying to synthesize. The same process that made apples into gold paste had, under slightly different conditions, produced something that looked like it could have pharmaceutical applications. She had not just invented a new food ingredient. She had accidentally recreated something her former employer had spent millions trying to engineer in a sterile laboratory. And she had done it with bruised apples and a tarp behind a barn. The implications unspooled in her mind like a chain reaction. If the peptide was stable and scalable, this was not just about restaurant menus anymore. This was about patents, clinical trials, licensing deals that could dwarf anything the Chicago conglomerate or even Noma could offer. But it also meant she would be pulled back into the exact world she had walked away from, the one that had nearly broken her. Joanna stood in the barn, holding a test tube full of cloudy liquid, and understood that she had just arrived at the most expensive crossroads of her life. The next move would determine not just her business, but whether the person she had become out here, among the rotten apples, was someone she intended to stay. Joanna made 3 phone calls the next morning. The first was to her former boss at the biotech firm. The second was to a patent attorney in Seattle who specialized in food science. The third was to the research director of the Noma Fermentation Lab in Copenhagen. She accepted their invitation. She told them about the accidental peptide, and she asked if they would be willing to partner on more than a consulting arrangement. The answer was yes before she'd finished explaining what she had found. What happened next unfolded with the speed of a chemical reaction once the catalyst hits. The Noma collaboration gave her immediate credibility that no corporate offer could match. Their legal team connected her with a firm that dismantled the conglomerate's provisional patent in 8 days, showing that Joanna's meticulous lab notebooks, the same ones she'd kept since batch 1, constituted verifiable prior art by nearly 13 months. The Chicago lawyers withdrew their filing and sent a letter stating they would pursue no further claims. The 7-figure offer vanished, replaced by nothing, which was exactly what Joanna wanted. The nuisance lawsuit proved even simpler to unravel. At the hearing, Joanna's attorney submitted documentation from the county health inspector, Diane, who had visited the property and approved it. He submitted lab reports showing that the odor was no different from a commercial composting operation, which was explicitly permitted under agricultural zoning. He submitted sales records showing that Millbrook Reserve Paste, the name Joanna had finally settled on, was generating taxable revenue and had been written up in 3 national food publications. The judge dismissed the case with prejudice and added on the record that the plaintiff might want to reconsider whether the smell of a successful business was actually a nuisance. The neighbor who had filed the lawsuit did not appeal. 6 months later, she bought a jar of the paste at the Bellingham Farmers Market and asked Joanna to sign the lid. The peptide discovery took longer to resolve, but the path it opened was the kind that rewrites a person's future. Joanna filed a provisional patent on the production method for the antimicrobial compound, then licensed it to her former employer under terms that allowed her to retain full ownership of the food side of the business. The licensing deal included an upfront payment of $2.6 million, rolling royalties on any pharmaceutical products developed, and a clause that prohibited the biotech firm from ever interfering with her farm operations. She walked into the signing meeting wearing the same barn boots she had worn to meet Marco Herrera. Her former boss told her she looked happy. She told him she had never been anything else out on that land. The money let her do what the conglomerate had wanted, but on her own terms. She bought the adjacent 5 acres, built a dedicated production facility with 8 climate-controlled fermentation rooms, and hired 6 full-time employees drawn from the same community that had once treated her like a pariah. Grant Ashby, the operations manager from Haverson Orchards, became her supply chain partner in an official capacity, routing every blemished, bruised, and hail-damaged apple from 6 regional orchards directly to her intake dock. The worst apples from the best trees, a closed loop that turned waste into a product most kitchens now considered essential. By year 4, Millbrook Reserve paste was in more than 200 restaurants across the United States and 12 internationally. Joanna had taught her process to fermentation teams at Noma, at Blue Hill at Stone Barns, at a research kitchen in Tokyo that specialized in koji applications. She never scaled so far that she lost the barn, though. The original pile site stayed exactly where it was, the same patch of grass where the first truckload had spilled. She built a small tasting room next to it, with a window that looked directly out at the mountain of fruit, because she had learned that people needed to see where things came from. They needed to understand that the ugly part was not separate from the beautiful part. It was the same process, just seen earlier in the timeline. The tasting room opened in March. On the first Saturday, the line stretched out to the county road. Among the first people through the door was the uncle who had told her to burn the pile and plant something sensible. He tried the 12-month aged paste on a cracker, closed his eyes, and said nothing for a long moment. Then he hugged her, which was not something her family did often. The second person through the door was one of the original neighbors who had slowed his truck to stare at the rotting heap. He bought a case for his restaurant and asked if she needed any help with distribution. She told him she would think about it, but what she was really thinking about was the very first week, when he had leaned out his window and shouted something she pretended not to hear. None of it erased those early months. Joanna still had the HOA letters in a drawer in the farmhouse. She kept them, she said, not out of bitterness, but because she wanted to remember that the people who call you crazy at the start are often the same ones who ask for a discount at the finish. The pile of apples behind the barn never got any prettier. The smell never got any milder. What changed was everything else. What changed was the story people told themselves about what they were looking at. And that, Joanna would tell you if you asked, is the entire trick. The fruit never knew it was supposed to be worthless. Someone had to decide to see it differently. Once one person did, the rest followed faster than you would ever believe. Joanna Voss still walks out to the pile every morning, rain or shine, the same patch of ground that nearly cost her everything. The smell hasn't changed. The neighbors haven't moved. The HOA letter is still in the drawer. What's different is that the world caught up to what she already knew. The things we throw away aren't empty. They're just waiting for someone to look long enough, close enough, stubbornly enough to see what's hiding in the rot. Most people will never do that. Most people will drive past, wrinkle their nose, and keep moving. But the ones who stop, who wonder why something was discarded, who ask whether the label worthless was ever actually earned, those are the people who end up holding gold while everyone else is still holding their breath. If this story made you look at something in your own life a little differently, a project you abandoned, an idea people laughed at, a pile of raw material you've been told isn't worth your time, consider this your sign to go back and check. Hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Like this video if you made it all the way to the end, and tell us in the comments about something you once overlooked that turned out to be valuable. Share this with someone who's sitting on their own pile of apples right now, wondering if anyone will ever understand what they see. And as always, let us know where in the world you're watching from tonight.